one of the first things I want to talk about is you're going to see a lot of similar themes between Roman's presentation and mine. And it's, because it is sort of what I see as the inherent truth in doing cyber investigations and responses. One of the things I want to do is try not to cover exactly what Roman covered, but give sort of experiences that I've had either through working with CERT, working in the private sector, and working with law enforcement. So it's a continuation of Roman's presentation. One of the first things I want to talk about is technology. And you've heard in Roman's presentation on his discussions on technology's role in responding to cyber incidents. Now, when a lot of us think of technology, we do think of, or when we do think of security, we think of technology. We think of firewalls and IPSs to keep the bad stuff out. We think of IDSs to detect bad stuff coming in. We think of data leakage monitoring to catch bad stuff going out, and antivirus to catch bad stuff that's already infected our systems and clean it up. However, technology is not the panacea to effectively investigating and responding to security incidents. The importance really is in the person or in the people. People do have a critical role. For example, let's take establishing pre- and post-incident objectives, so sort of COP, what Roman was talking about. Technology doesn't necessarily pivot like a person would do. For example, you find certain information that will give you a whole nother area to look at, then a person will easily adjust to then look down another path of investigation. Technology perhaps doesn't make those types of judgment decisions. Furthermore, technology doesn't understand sort of the significance of outliers and making correlations. These are the things that perhaps are novel, they're new, they're things that don't initially appear to be part of a, maybe there's a precursor. Technology may not catch that, but the human will catch that. So the proverbial question is, how do you respond to large-scale cyber incidents effectively? Fortunately, I don't have all the answers, but the areas that I want to provide information are preparing and planning, establishing event boundaries, managing large data sets, and involving law enforcement. So let's look at preparing and planning. For many of you, this may seem fairly obvious, especially if you're already in the security field. However, from my experience and the experience of others, a lot of large corporations don't incorporate some of the basics, such as establishing a capability. There have been incidents that I've been involved with involving Fortune 500 companies in which corporations didn't actually have an established team to do incident response and investigations. They relied on IT staff to do that, and unfortunately, IT staff did not understand sort of best practices and conducted investigations in a poor way, as in law enforcement we say basically trampling over evidence. Another thing that Roman pointed out is when you establish a team, one of the important things is your manpower. When looking at manpower, we think of technical expertise. We got somebody who's really smart at understanding the operating system, network traffic, somebody who's good at reverse engineering. However, technical expertise doesn't necessarily equal responder investigative expertise. It's a completely different mindset, almost at opposite ends of the spectrum, where technical expertise is more black and white. Good responder investigative techniques or capabilities is more abstract. In other words, you really need to think critically, like, I see something here, it's not necessarily recognizable as a precursor or indicator of an attack. However, as we say in law enforcement speak, the hairs of the back of your neck, it just makes it stand up. This is what I would call differentiating between something that's suspicious and taking that and finding enough more information to then escalate, whether or not you want to escalate it to reasonable suspicion or just let it go as it's just an artifact of regular behavior. So the analogy in law enforcement that I want to place on this is the difference between suspicion and reasonable suspicion. So I was a police officer for 5 years, and we patrol our beats, and we would see, say, driving in a certain area. Let's just example an industrial area. Late at night, you see somebody, or it's empty, and you see somebody there who's sort of casing the joint. That's suspicion. That's the thing that you look at and, well, you don't necessarily know that something is afoot. You don't know what crime's at foot, but you want to check that out. You want to look into that. You stop, you talk to the guy, you find out, he's a worker. He's doing maintenance, he works a night shift. You de-escalate. It's a legitimate artifact. Perhaps you tell your beat partners, record that so that, another person, another day driving will know that this person. However, in the case you observe this and, the person now has a bag of goods or has burglary tools, that's reasonable suspicion. You now need to stop, initiate investigation, and take it a little bit further. Now, I want to take this principle and apply it to cybersecurity. It's the same thing. There are certain precursors or indicators that an analyst may detect that in itself is not a reasonable suspicion, but could be suspicious. Now, does that analyst pursue it or not? My thought is anything suspicious probably should be pursued a little bit, because that evidence or that data in itself is not, by itself is not perhaps an indicator of an attack. However, combined with data stored in other areas, could be good evidence that an attack is occurring or attack has occurred. While establishing manpower, it's good for a team to have both the technical and investigative and responder expertise. Roman talked about sort of the uber senior analyst or the responder who sort of has both expertise. Very hard to find that, but one of the things I would recommend is incorporating sort of both types of analysts or responders on a team together, working together so that each of them could build off of the expertise of the other. It's important to have dedicated lab and analysis space, both physical and virtual. I've seen businesses that actually have their incident responders share office space with non-security, basically one big office, one big floor, and non-security personnel there. And unfortunately, that's not ideal, particularly because you want the responders and the analysts to be able to talk freely and openly about the cases, and also, hey, I'm seeing this, it's very unusual. What do you think about it? Ping back that information and create a feedback loop. You want to have a robust analytical platform. Roman sort of talked about which tools you use. I have 7 analysts. They use 7 different tools. Again, I'm going to just repeat what he said. It's not really important on what tools you use. It's more important on the analyst and how the analysts use those tools. So the other area in preparation is establishing best practices. So what I've heard in the past dealing with sort of these information securities that don't necessarily have the investigative law enforcement experiences, I don't want to do best practices because it's just too much extra work, or the common theme is it will never go to trial, so why do I need to follow best practices? Best practices are important just to minimize mistakes. I mean, just in itself. I've done a lot of the investigations, post-investigations I've done. I've seen things such as incident responders using VI text editor, which is a Linux text editor, to view logs on a live compromised system during an incident response. Now, I don't know why anyone would use a text editor to view logs, but what happened was now during the litigation, it brings on the potential that the belief that incident response may have altered logs. Now, probably like they didn't, but there are other mechanisms to use to view logs and not VI. Likewise, in a case, incident responder used Windows Explorer to search for malware in the system. And during the analysis, I saw that this name of a malware file kept on popping up everywhere. And I'm thinking, wow, there's a lot of artifacts. Come to find out, that was just artifacts caused by incident response, putting data on the drives and on the evidence. Furthermore, these were done without documented. So incident responders that did this had no documentation that they did do that. Just poor practices. And finally, establishing a chain of custody. I've been in situations where I've asked an incident responder, where did this come from? Where did this data come from? Where did it originate from? Response was, I don't know. I don't know where I got it from. So going to the sort of the idea that, well, never go to trial, so why do we need to follow best practices? Besides the fact that it minimizes mistakes, it may not be the judge, jury necessarily, but it could be the CIO or commander or director who's taking your analysis and making a executive decision. I would hate to make a mistake because of poor best practices and have a large, business decision be made on that. And it may not go to trial, but likely, it may go to possibly litigation or tribunal where your work is put in front of a forum of people and you will be judged on, your ability to do that work. So just some good best practice guide resources there are listed up there. NIST has some very good documentations, 886 as well as 861. SWIG-D, which is a scientific working group of digital evidence, and Association of Chiefs of Police, Good Practice Guide to Digital Evidence. So the next step in preparation is understanding network and its assets, particularly with large organizations and large enterprises. Enterprise-level networks can be just a disparate conglomeration of linked networks. Organizations experience growth, expansions, mergers, acquisitions, adoption of new technology, retention of legacy technology. And what happens is you have really nobody in the organizations that understands the full scope of the type of data, not just the technology, but the assets that are stored on that. It's a good role for incident response or digital investigations teams to take this as a mission to be able to identify the different networks, the different domains, as well as the different owners of those domains. During the thick of an incident, you don't want to then determine, okay, well, what data is here, or how do I need to find a contact for a certain network. It's good to have that in advance. With that, establishing contacts and line of communication, particularly with IT, domain and asset owners and data custodians. So one important reason is obvious is, you want to get on the phone and call someone that you've already talked to, but getting them to understand your requirements. Understand that IT may not understand your mission and your requirements. So when you ask for data collection, the due diligence that you would think would occur may not occur. And my experience, there have been a few times in which there was inaccurate data collection based upon IT. They're busy. Their scope is to maintain the IT infrastructure. They don't necessarily understand that the data you need needs to be completely accurate, it needs to be verified, and so forth. So building that relationship beforehand and getting to understand your objective so that when a data collection needs to occur, it's to your requirements. It's very important. Likewise, legal counsel. Establishing relationships with legal counsel is important as well. And I had a discussion recently, which a security professional stated, he's been pretty successful with keeping legal counsel away from the work that they do. I tend to disagree. I think legal counsel could be your best ally, particularly because when you need something done, if you go to legal counsel, present a legal reason for that organization to get it done, it's very helpful. Human resources for insider threats, physical security, there's a lot of disconnect between cyber and physical security as well. So it's good to maintain relationships with these groups. Also in preparation, it's very important to maintain situational awareness. Now what that is a good understanding of what's currently going on in your networks. So having the ability to be able to access things such as network flows, logs, alerts, enterprise forensics, and reporting, not just security reporting, but IT general supporting as well is important. To give you an example on the last reporting, there was a forensic analysis I did in which the incident occurred a few years prior to the actual detection. So the intrusion occurred, IT responded because of a crashed machine. Machine crashed and it rebooted, and 2 years later determined that that was actually the intrusion, which was persistent for the 2 years. If that information is important, it's a crash. Now, systems crash, it's not uncommon. However, taking that data and perhaps investigating if you had a security team, incident responder or forensics team, and looking into that, maybe spending a little bit of time and diligence looking into that crash. In this case, it would have given them the information, or it would have alerted them to the intrusion. With that same investigation, that there was a Antivirus Alert that occurred 2 years before the intrusion was detected. So crashes are one thing, but antivirus alerts that don't get sort of investigated, I don't know what the thinking was. Perhaps it's clean, antivirus is off the system. In this case, it was an actual server, and antivirus detected it was PSExec, which is a program used to execute programs remotely. Antivirus cleaned it. However, if the incident responders were to actually look at that machine, they would have also seen that there were approximately 7 or 8 other hacking tools that were placed on the machine as well, one of them giving the attacker remote access. So the idea that an antivirus alert doesn't get investigated further, especially on a server, a critical server in this case, is very important with situational awareness to detect and respond to early indicators or precursors of attacks. Having situational awareness also helps you build a baseline of outline activity. What I mean by that is you understand what goes on your network. It's back to that scenario in which I told you about the police officer finding the guy who's possibly scoping out a business. That police officer who sees that, interviews him, knows, hey, he's legitimate. So the next time he sees him or next time someone calls about him, hey, I know who that guy is, he's legitimate. You don't need to go down that whole rabbit hole and stop and interview him. It's the same in cyber. Certain artifacts or certain things that go on that aren't necessarily normal, if you understand it as being, well, I've looked into this, it's legitimate, I document it, I put it in a wiki or in a SIM or something, so that during an incident and you're doing an investigation, you may see this and you could just, I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, I'm just going to focus on the things that I've never seen before. So establishing that baseline of outline activity is important. And also ability to correlate indicators. In other words, taking indicators, from one log and correlating it from another log in itself may not be, taking this log and looking at that indicator may not be, may not put the hairs, make the hairs stand on the back of your neck, but taking them and putting them together then creates a higher level of either suspicion or reasonable suspicion. It's also important to understand a digital threat. Attackers out there, digital crime has evolved to an enterprise, basically. It's matured to levels of organized crime. The hacker is actually a CEO managing teams responsible for different aspects. Your team responsible for development, team responsible for monetizing data, teams responsible for intrusions, teams responsible for post-intrusion persistence. Understanding this is important because this is what you're up against. You're not necessarily up against a lone hacker. You're up against resources of teams of dozens of people. Diversification and specialization of service is what I talked about. But the one particular that I want to talk about is specialization and monetizing data. There's data on your systems that to you may not, why would an attacker want that? Well, that may have value to an attacker. For example, cases that I've worked on, we've seen attackers target the following. Databases of rejected loan applications. For this purpose, they were going to use that to do phishing against the people that were rejected for loans. The fact that they were rejected for loans, get an email saying, well, guess what? We found a loan that you've been approved for. The potential victims are more apt to respond to those. We saw attackers targeting airlines' internal aircraft routing plans. Why would they want that? Well, this attacker in particular was selling it and giving that information to drug distributors so that they knew and they could get people who work for the airline crews, the ground crews, to use planes to smuggle drugs. And if they could track the routing plans, they knew that this plane would go from here and stop off at here, and they would just need to recruit people at the airport to stow the drugs on the planes, and they could be recovered at the airport that the planes land at. And finally, corporations pre-reporting financials. It's obvious that this information could be used for financial benefit for people that invest money in the stock market and so forth. And finally, espionage. I think most of us here have probably read the Mandiant reports or familiar with it, so I really don't need to go into detail about espionage. But considering that, there's data on there on your systems that you may not think that has any value. So So I'm ready for the first set of questions.
Okay. From Todd asking, his organization is thinking of starting a computer forensics group within the company. How do they go about identifying the right people with the right technical skills to bring on board, and what type of training do you recommend? Kind of going along with you and Roman talking about it's the right people with the right training. What is the right training?
So there is actually a lot of training available in sort of the fields of forensics. I mean, they're private SANs, they're the vendors of the tools. CERT, we actually offer training in forensics. So as far as training itself, just Google forensics training. There's quite a bit of training out there. Now, identifying the right people, it probably a little bit more difficult. I think it goes back to having a good mix between people that are technical, that are able to understand, the operating system or the kernel or RAM, as well as investigative and response, people that are expertise in investigative response, former law enforcement that have forensics background that may not be as technical as somebody who's a computer science major, but it's important to combine both types of people. I think if you focus on just, taking in, former law enforcement without, who have good technical experience, but maybe not have good investigative experience, but maybe not the good technical experience, or taking sort of technical people without having the law enforcement, investigative, or corporate investigation experience, you're going to have sort of this groupthink mentality in your team, which you want to avoid.
Okay, this is more of a comment from Sean, but maybe it'll bring a reaction out of you. Just saying, the continuous mitigation of cyber threats seems to see the need for the use of varying techniques in preventative or curative measures. But I believe some studies should be done on understanding the cyber attacker or criminal, and this will aid in the investigation.
Completely agree. There are actually groups. So unfortunately, it's harder to get information on the cyber attacker and criminal than it is on sort of the attacks themselves. Attacks themselves leaves artifacts on computer systems. Attack tools are available either freely on the internet or through distribution channels. The attacker organizations themselves, typically very difficult to necessarily infiltrate unless, say, law enforcement makes an arrest and is able to interview and turn that person into an informant. However, there are businesses and organizations that do specialize in infiltrating, sort of intelligence-based, getting information on attack organizations. Now, one way, there are ways for just an individual who maybe has no prior connections to organizations to get some information, and perhaps there are forums, hacking forums that, again, I'm not suggesting go log on and start looking and posting on hacking forums, but it's a good source of information to see, the discussions that go on amongst the different hackers, the tools, and so forth. It's a difficult thing, but I do agree. It's very important to understand that the hacker organization, the hacker mentality, hacker objectives, and so forth, in order to understand the threat against your enterprise.
Okay, we'll fit one more question in this section, and this is from David asking, one example you used indicated a crashed server that had been compromised or exploited through the use of a remote tool, and introduced several other unwanted tools. Were those intrusions not detected? Would an IDS or IPS not have been useful?
So I really don't want to have this. I really don't want to make too many comments about usefulness of technology. The technology is as good as the rule sets you put into them. So would an IDS or IPS detect it? Perhaps, if you have robust rule sets. Now, the thing to consider is that the attackers are changing sophisticated attackers are changing their techniques based on sort of like an arms war, based on sort of the technology used to prevent them. The good example I can give is antivirus. Attackers that use malware are constantly testing their malware against antivirus. So if I wanted to target company A and I knew they use semantic antivirus, I get a copy myself, update the signatures, test that against my malware. And if it detects it, I alter, I obfuscate it, I do something to change it so that it no longer is detected. So the point being is the tools are important, but complete reliance on tools, probably a better, something that Roman, again, was talking about, something better would be, just look on the computer. You got something that's suspicious. How long, it's going to take to perhaps, again, a lot of it has to do with the things put in place prior. So if you've put in place the ability to do, say, enterprise forensics, it should take you a few minutes to just do a preview to see what's going on there. If you don't have enterprise forensics or the tools in place, it may take longer, but really it's the person who needs to go in to investigate and not just rely on detection by a specific tool.
I lied. One more question.
Okay.
Great question from Mike, asking. Their typical IT staff is typically an enlisted soldier, sailor, Marine, airman deployed for long periods in hostile environments with limited experience and knowledge. How do they get the training and the skills to be these industry analysts you and Roman are talking about? How do they get this training?
So, again, there's a lot of training out there. I think it's important for that organization to see the importance of that type of training. In other words, the organization needs to make the first step and say, we want to invest resources and money in taking our staff and sending them to the training that's out there. Again, at Google, I'm familiar with SANS. SANS has a large repertoire of forensics and cyber investigation training. CERT, we offer cyber investigation training. We offer it's like a 4 or 5 day forensics course. It's not currently offered, but I'm working on a 4-day basic digital investigations course that we should be offering, soon. Training is out there. It's just a step of whether or not.
I would chime in for Mike for later in the day. He's going to be very interested in the Step Forward platform that we're going to see a demo of. That sounds like it would be ideal for the situation he's speaking of. Okay, let's move on.
So establishing event boundaries. I'm going to have to probably pick it up a little bit for a matter of time. So similar to a triage, so Roman talked a lot about triage, kind of stole my thunder, but I'm going to continue this, and I'm going to give you the kinetic analogy or kinetic incident analogy. So let's take the whole police scenario. Police are on scene on a major incident. What do they focus on, right? They don't just sort of rambling look around and say, okay, what are we going to do? They have a very sort of strict objective, and usually it's in this order. Make the scene safe. You need to stop the threat first because safety is most important. Care for the injured. Critical and serious first, not so critical later. Secure the scene. Secure the scene so that any evidence remains and doesn't get tampered with. Conduct interviews. You start with interviewing site witnesses first, and then later on knock on doors and locate other witnesses. And then finally collect evidence, volatile first and non-volatile. Well, there's not a lot of difference. I mean, the principle is the same with cyber incidents in the sense that you do need a plan of attack, and you do sort of need to identify what's most important first before you actually carry out your response. So how do you decide triage? Well, it depends. Like the police incident, the police are not necessarily going to follow each step in that exact order. So, for example, you have a major incident in which the attacker is still at large, and he's seen as not safe, and he's confined by the SWAT team. Does that mean they have to wait till he gets arrested before they can start talking to people? No, that's not exactly true. Likewise with cyber, it depends. And here's some of the factors in which will influence what steps you take first. The type of attack. The difference, say, between a DDoS, a phishing, or a insider threat attack is huge. An insider threat, you assume information has been stolen. So it's how do you identify what information was stolen? How do you prevent that person from having any type of remote access to any more data? Whereas the DDoS, the triage may not necessarily be, well, information may have not been stolen, but we need to look for secondary or tertiary attacks parallel to the DDoS, because commonly that's a tactic attackers use. Impact of attack is important. If it's attack on a SCADA system, impact is potentially damage to equipment or life. So you need to focus on the safety prior to say, let's save evidence. Policy and procedure obviously will guide your triage. Situation awareness. If you've implemented situations beforehand, knowing your network and knowing the type of traffic, that will also guide you on your triage. Available technology. Some enterprises that implement enterprise-level SIMs or forensic platforms, you could easily do triage fairly quickly by just spending a few minutes and looking at running processes on a certain machine that you believe is compromised. Without that technology, triage becomes different. How do you then get that data from a machine that could be geographically located in a different state or a different country? And it's all based on empirical evidence Again, it's a dynamic scenarios, and I guess I'd cover this a little bit earlier, in which responders should be able to pivot based upon information gained. You get a piece of information, you use that to then determine the next steps and help you establish your overall objectives. But also information and advantage you got through your planning will help you. And again, the term that Roman had said I would use, maintaining the velocity of the investigation. Very critical in doing triage is if you're going to spend a lot of time on a certain artifact that doesn't allow you to maintain the investigation, perhaps you need to move on. What that means is speed is essential, especially in attacks. You need to be like a police officer who needs to neutralize a threat. You need to be able to quickly react to that threat and quickly pivot to the dynamic situation. So let's just look at a couple areas during triage that commonly are looked at, starting with logs. Depending on the size and scope of logs, it could be very painful to do triage against logs. Now, hopefully, as a team, you've implemented the technology to lessen the pain. So, for example, a SIM or SIM or something to basically collect logs in a central location and index it is very helpful, because if you're responding to an incident and the answer, the golden answer, isn't stored in a log, and you have to wait for IT to go in another state or another country to basically go and physically collect the logs off the box, or if you need to go and perhaps SSH or remotely log onto a box, copy the logs off, and then search using a text editor, which probably shouldn't be doing, or using some type of search tool, it slows the velocity of investigation. You want to be able to basically look, here's something going on, pivot, physically pivot, go to the next computer screen, type in and do a search, and be able to then say, well, what I see going on based upon my search of the logs, it's an attack, it's an attack that got in, and so forth. Local logs, too, may be fruitful. So even if you're remotely collecting logs, what I found is there's a lot of sort of the outlying logs that you may have thought about, application logs, crash logs that sit on the machines. And so you may need to go on that machine and start to collect those. But usually that's later during the analysis stage. Very hard to look for local logs without knowing what you're looking for. So typically what I've done is during forensic analysis, I'll search for critical indicators. And I've been very successful in finding those indicators, whether it be like a IP address, a domain, a name of a file, find those in logs I've never even knew existed. But when I looked at those logs, I'm like, oh, okay, that's what that log does. Here's the evidence. Here's that indicator. Here's a process number. Here's the name of the IP address it's using. I found it in several logs. I mean, so one was Altiris inventory monitoring log stored locally. Not used for security, it's used mainly for IT inventory, but found a lot of data that helped with the investigation, including sort of a timeline of processes that were run, starting with ping, starting with the process, the malware that was being run and the different tools that the attackers used. So it gave me a good indicator of exactly what the malware the attackers were targeting. Log analysis is very difficult, but there's a list up there. I'm not going to go through everything in a matter of time. You can preview it when you look at the slides, but it's good to start with something known, either an indicator or time element, and then based on that, get enough information to then work your way and build out to then identify additional indicators within the logs. So now let's move on to disk artifacts. So I said earlier, forensic imaging is time-consuming. So if you have an incident and you need to go and image 40 hard drives, 50 hard drives, before you can start to do your analysis, it hinders the velocity of investigations. Enterprise tools could make the job easier. It could give you the ability to, say, collect the same type of data across 40 machines, because maybe it's that one piece of data, maybe it's that one file, or maybe it's just RAM memory across those machines that you need to look at to determine whether or not that machine is compromised. From a business perspective, it saves a lot of time. Forensic analysis, the imaging process, the analysis process, it takes a long time. And again, like I said, it just hinders that velocity of investigation. Also, utilizing a tiered approach may be better. So to start with, maybe you want to just look at specific artifacts on a box. I'm just going to pull RAM on all these boxes and analyze it first. Based on that, I am then going to determine whether or not I then forensically image the hard drive. That type of approach is probably a better approach to take because it helps with the velocity of investigation, but then it also gives you the totality of information you may need for the investigation down the road. Even if you're conducting triage, again, this is the theme that I'm going to keep on bringing up, still good to follow forensic best practices. I talked to you about the few times I observe responders trampling over evidence. Yeah, that's just a big no-no. Live data acquisition. So back in 2002, when I first learned forensics, I was taught the traditional method of you cannot put your hands on the keyboard. You need to pull the plug, because if you put your hands on the keyboard and if you type something in, you're changing the evidence and it's going to be thrown out of court. Well, that's no longer the case. Particularly, it's now, I would say, a myth. And in many cases, it's critical that you do what's called live forensics, basically doing forensics on boxes without pulling them offline or pulling the plug. And several reasons. In 2007, I was actually an agent here as a liaison with CERT, and CERT assisted us with the case Iceman, also known as Max Butler. And there was enough intelligence that he was using full disk encryption on everything. And if we were to go in and do the search warrant and pull the plugs, we probably would lose everything because you're getting basically a drive that's full disk encryption. So the idea is we now need to do live acquisitions while the boxes are powered on in order to capture that data. That's just one example. Other examples would be you're a business and you can't take the machine, you can't take the box down. It's critical. You need it to be up. So doing live forensic imaging, not just in the business sense, but in law enforcement, again, it's the norm. And with that, the limitations are very little as far as you can still do full disk acquisition, partition, or just logical files. So along with live disk imaging is the importance of RAM imaging. Only within the last couple of years, law enforcement, and it's not necessarily across the board yet, see the importance of collecting RAM, particularly, as I mentioned, in cases where full disk encryption or container-based encryption is being used, but also in cases where it's a victim computer and there's artifacts in RAM that are volatile. In other words, if you pull the plug, those artifacts are gone and are not written on disk. I got a list up there, running processes, network connections, listing ports, contents of a RAM drive, and malware that only runs in RAM. So what's interesting is I always want to tie sort of these talks into current ongoing things, and I went to my trusty Slashdot and looked at an article that was posted yesterday. Reference a netsecurity.org article about a recent a sophisticated Apache backdoor that was found in the wild. This Apache backdoor basically stores the files in the shared memory of Linux. In other words, in RAM. So attackers are taking data, they're storing it in RAM as a RAM drive, so that if a incident responder pulls a plug and images a hard drive, artifacts, or in this case, only one artifact existed on the hard drive itself. Using the old techniques of powering down, in this case, probably wouldn't find what you need to find. So being able to analyze RAM, very important. Live acquisition may be required when you're dealing with software raids. Those of you who've done forensics and tried to put together raids by imaging drives independently know it's fairly difficult, particularly in the case with software raids. You may just need to do live imaging to get the entire drive as opposed to individual drives, entire rated drive as opposed to individual drives. And for law enforcement, there's actually restrictions by court. And the court will say, you can pull images, but keep the business up. Don't take them down. And so as a law enforcement agent, you're doing a search warrant, you have to do live imaging because you can't power the machine down. And finally, we see a lot of services now being run on sort of virtual and VMware type, where you have multiple businesses on one physical box. VPS, virtual private server type environments. So that being said, for law enforcement in particular, or even in enterprise, you can't shut that whole box down and shut all those services. You need to do live forensic imaging and obtain the virtual image. So went through that fairly quickly.
Yeah, and I know you got some more slides to get through, so we'll keep this one quick. I wanted to just do a couple quick housekeeping items since we're going to wrap this up at 12:30. For anybody staying with us through the next session, you will see a purple globe icon in your widget. Once this session closes, just before the console shuts down, just click on that widget. It'll take you to a website where you can launch the afternoon session. So you will need to log in again for the afternoon session. You also see a survey widget. We definitely want to hear your feedback on what you think of today's presentations, so be sure to fill that out. And then on to a question here from Michael asking, is there a resource somewhere that has a list of common log locations, default log locations for various software packages?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't know of any, although there are some very good forensic blogs out there by some sort of key, recognized as sort of the key forensic experts globally that talk about sort of looking at specific applications or specific indicators and finding them. I don't know of a source that sort of combines it all into one sort of central location. Off the top of my hand, I would imagine. So typically what I like to do is Google. I'm doing my forensic analysis in Google or whatever web browser, and the answer is generally there. So it may not be in a central location, but I'll find either technical report about the product. I'll find perhaps additional work or earlier work that was done by a forensic analyst who posted it on their blog, or perhaps I'll just get the program, install it myself in a virtual environment, and look to see myself where a log's being stored. Because ultimately, a lot of times is you take those extra steps to study the application yourself. Because understanding what the application does, it's better to do it with your own eyes. That actually works better for court because you can, if for those of law enforcement or those may have to testify in a trial or court, is to say I installed it and I observed it myself to create these artifacts, as opposed to relying on a third party who's posted it in a blog.
Okay, and just one other thing for me, and this is just a side note. Some of the people may be having bandwidth issues out there, asking if this is being recorded. It is. So if anybody's running into those type of issues today, the whole event is being captured, will be available on demand within the next few days. So we can move on back to the slides, but I just wanted to give you that note.
All right. So the next issue I want to talk about managing large data sets, and it's something that I think everyone struggles with. So if you look at the bottom part of the slide, you see consumer hard drives. And this is not even talking about enterprise level. This is just consumer. Grew from 2007 from 1 terabyte to 2011, 3 terabyte. And I think 4 terabyte drives are either out or going to be available. Or enclosures that can go up to 8 terabytes. Now, these are consumer grade, what people could have in their homes. At CERT, we've assisted law enforcement with tackling this problem, particularly because traditionally law enforcement, like this, the way I learned, and what's still commonly done is sort of the singular, the one drive, work on one drive, use one machine, one analyst at one time. So the idea is that I take a hard drive, I look at that separately. And then I take the next hard drive, look at that separately. Maybe I'll combine the information together, but it's with these large data sets, it's the whole paradigm shift has to move away from that. It has to move towards more of a clustered or a distributed type of environment. On the right side, you see recent case history. These are cases that we've assisted law enforcement in. 2007, we assisted them with processing 6 terabytes of data for the Iceman case. 2009, it was 21 terabytes. 2010 for NASDAQ, 80 terabytes. Mega upload, it with petabyte levels. The idea is that it's not all of this may not be evidence, but the idea is you have to manage it. You have to triage this. You have to look through that and determine what's critical, what's important. The drive size are only going to increase. So how do you manage that? Again, big data problems is big headaches, basically. So it's very important during your triaging and understanding the network to be able to say, well, I know that data that I need sits right here. I'm just going to pull that and look at that first. I'm not going to image all these 40 computers and then start looking for it. So in law enforcement, what I've seen happen was when we have these large data sets that need to be looked at, what I've seen happen was that agency will find several forensic analysts into a central location and divide the drives up. You look at this, you look at this, you look at that. It's not cost effective, but it limits the type of correlation you can do, because this agent here sees something, or this analyst sees something, this analyst sees something. By itself, not important, but two pieces of data together, critical. Those correlations don't necessarily get made. And the other method I've seen is actually just dividing the images up and then shipping them out. Again, maybe more cost effective, but you miss out on the correlations. So one of the things that we developed here at CERT was something called CCAP, which is basically a clustered computing analyst platform. We've used it, it's been around for some time, and it's something that I actually used on some of the investigations we did as a Secret Service agent. And the idea is that instead of following that one forensic analyst box, one drive, one software, it's storing things centrally, storing all your images centrally, having tools in which multiple people can then access remotely through VPNs and tokens and so forth, security based on the requirements of your agency, and then do not just limited to just forensics, but other things such as password cracking, log analysis, and so forth. The other thing I want to talk about that I found extremely successful in the work I've done is importance of malware analysis and responses, particularly intrusion responses. Intrusions, a lot of times, the malware tools or so forth are being used. It's like the equivalent to my Kinetic example. That's sort of like the bomb or the weapon that's left on the scene. Right? There's a data in there that could be used to determine attribution or perhaps intent. So taking the malware and analyzing it in depth could provide a lot of information to you, just like the bomb or the gun. For example, how does it infect and spread? How does it remain on the system? Is it persistent? Does it have the capability to exfiltrate data, which is really important, particularly for businesses that need to, for litigation purposes or regulation compliance? Can it be accessed remotely? And what are the artifacts that I can find that could be used to mitigate our attribution? A couple of cool artifacts that I found were in the past were an encryption key, a very unique encryption key that was embedded in the malware that we were able to use to search our artifact catalog to be able to find other pieces of malware to do a correlation between, because it was so unique that we knew this, only this attacker used this key. Another interesting thing that we found during malware analysis is a path of the user's directory embedded after, when it was compiled. The path had the user directory, which is in a native language encoding. So that gave us a good idea of the source of the malware, which country, as well as the what we think is the name of the person who compiled the malware. One of the problems with malware analysis is it's time-consuming. So those of you that are familiar with reverse engineering, or even dynamic runtime analysis, it takes a lot of time. It hinders the velocity of investigation. If you find a piece of malware on your system and you want to find out what's this command and control, or does it exfiltrate data, or is there any config files it tries to access, or what the mutexes are, does it drop any files, and you send it off to an analyst, depending on what he does, you may, if he does dynamic, you may get that back within a day or so. If you send it off to someone to do some reverse engineering and static analysis, it may take a couple of days. And do you wait that long? So one of the methods that I like and that I've used successfully is sort of automating that process. Now, I'm not saying it's a replacement for the manual process. That's very important. But the automated process does get you information you need quickly in a matter of maybe 3 minutes for you to continue your investigation. So one of the platforms that we've developed here at CERT is something called MACARTA, which stands for Malicious Code Automated Runtime Analysis. And it uses multiple tools, open source and commercial tools. It uses some in-house technology, some glue. It's put together, and the idea is that a piece of malware, you get an answer back in 3 minutes. Now, it's not going to be an answer of everything you need. It's not going to be maybe the answer you want to take to court. You may want to rely on someone to reverse it, but it's enough for you to continue investigation. So putting that all together, here's like a good presentation, and you need your flow charts. Here's my flow chart. Here's a whole process, including malware analysis, including the disk analysis, as well as the preparation and so forth. As you see, you start with preparation, move to triage, then your collection, and then you go into your world of analysis. Which analysis you do first depends on the type of information you've collected and you've identified through your triage. But as you can see, there's loopbacks. There's like a feedback loop. So when I do my malware analysis, the information I find in that, I go and here's a command and control domain name, or here's something unique. I search for that in my logs or in my disk analysis, on my disk. Likewise, if I find artifacts on disk, I'm doing a disk analysis, and I see that during the time element, here's interesting files. Let's say Windows. There's interesting executables that were created around the same time. There's 10 of them. Just from looking at the content, I don't know for sure that it's malware, but it's suspicious. Well, do I take all 10 of this, send it over to an analyst to look at 10, or do I just send all 10 straight to my automated process, get the answers back in 3 minutes, and then say, well, of these 10, I can see these 9s, or, based on the automated analysis, don't appear to be malware related or so forth. Here's one that obviously is. Let's focus on that one. So here's a couple examples, more examples I'd like to give you of actual outliers that I found, which provided very critical information to an incident and investigation. I've already talked about tools and malware resident in RAM. I've actually seen that not common, but I've seen it in some major intrusions. Malware injected into legitimate processes. This is commonly seen with the POS, point of sale terminal investigations, which a point of sale terminal gets compromised probably through like a remote access that was set up by the third-party vendor who set up the point of sale. What we've seen is attackers coming on and injecting the software used to process the credit cards with malware, so it's actually injected into that software. And what happens in point of sales is, the credit card numbers or the credit card track data is which the attackers are targeting. Now that's generally encrypted on disk or encrypted in transit. However, in RAM, it's not encrypted. So the attacker, basically, the ability to inject the process allows it access to the RAM space, and its malware then basically scrapes RAM for anything indicative of a credit card track data using like a regex expression. It pulls it down and it writes it to a file. Attacker comes back in through the remote desktop or PC anywhere, pulls that off. Traditionally, if you think I'm looking for evidence of malware and intrusion, you're not going to find it. But what you're going to find are the outlier. Basically, that's that process which is injected with the malware itself. But it's very difficult to detect. You're not going to have a lot of evidence. DNS. The last Roman's presentation, someone had a question about DNS. I've seen DNS being used to exfiltrate data. Actually, not just exfiltrate, but to create a out-of-band communication using something called DNS to TCP. The incident responders, didn't actually look at the DNS logs, and I was able to look at the DNS logs and find base 64 data. It's obvious, right? It's an outlier, but it's an obvious outlier. Take that, convert that, and basically information on, that was the actual data that was exfiltrated after converting those DNS queries. So we were able to determine what data was exfiltrated. We've seen HTTP posts from malware, which are actually, we've seen exfiltrated data, which are embedded using steganography in images, which are then sent via HTTP post. So very difficult to detect if you're just monitoring logs, or if you have some technology that's looking for at your web gateway, how do you detect it's a JPEG or a GIF being posted? That may have to take a person to figure that out. Post request of exploit strings contained in malware binary encoded web application error log. So in this particular case, it was an intrusion through a web application vulnerability, and the malware was actually sent and ran through this a string through an HTTP post. But if you look in the Apache logs, you couldn't see the URI or the contents of the post. However, if you were to look at the Tomcat application logs, and you would spend a lot of time. You would finally, and if those of you that looked at Tomcat logs are pretty huge, and they're not easy to analyze. We're able to find the actual URI, which contained encoded data, 1,000 lines of encoded data. Ability to pull that out, convert that back to the binary, we're able to then run it in a sandbox and reverse it and determine, oh, look, here's the malware that was being sent. Like this case that I talk about here, I've seen that where lightweight HTTP servers were being run on boxes to not just infect machines in this case, which was the black hole rootkit, but to also exfiltrate data out from a system. And the final one, the final outlier, which I thought was pretty cool, was attackers had basically all their goods, fruits of the crime, gzipped it, which basically encrypted it on a box and then exfiltrated and then wiped that. However, what we found was artifacts in the Linux swap file in which we're able to rebuild the gzips or the tar files and then be able to determine what that, the actual files. We're able to actually retrieve the files. It didn't sit on disk on the file system. It was in swap. But having a person look at that and be like, hey, look, that's interesting. That's a header. That's a tar header. What's it doing there? Let's look at the text content. Okay, that's stuff that shouldn't be in. All right, let's try and work on. That's the hair that stands up in the back of your neck. To pursue that was very critical. I got 3 minutes. I got
Go ahead and finish your slides, and then we'll take some questions at the end. Yeah.
This will be really fast. It's basically involving law enforcement. Those of you that are non-law enforcement, non-government, business enterprises, may have not initially or may have not already established relationships. Very important to do that before an incident, not during an incident. There are mechanisms such as the U.S. Secret Service, electronic task forces, FBI, InfraGard in the U.S. And I understand we have some, if we have some international people watching, there's organizations internationally as well. Get involved with these, understand who your contact is, understand what their mission, what their objectives are, and build that relationship. So the type of engagements typically that I've seen are, there's two. Generally, there's where the organization approaches law enforcement and says, hey, I think we've been hacked. Help us out. What do we do? One of the things for that is don't assume the responding agents know the technology as well you do. So law enforcement agents, the disparity between technical knowledge could be from here to here. But mostly the knowledge of business enterprises is lacking in law enforcement. So they may understand forensics, right? They may understand the operating system. But do they understand the whole scope of what a business enterprise, from the security systems to the, you name it, whatever, the architecture? Probably not. So don't assume that. Also, don't assume they don't necessarily do. There are those in law enforcement that either came from enterprise IT or have good grasp on that. But it's important to have that open discussion with the law enforcement agents that respond to understand their level of competency. The other type of engagement is where law enforcement approaches the organization, and this does happen often, is, hey, we have evidence you've been hacked. Law enforcement, through another investigation, finds data, either stored in some server, that it's exfiltrated data from an organization. Law enforcement takes it to that organization, and we have evidence that you've been hacked. And a lot of times the organization says, no, we haven't been. Right? We haven't been hacked. It's difficult for law enforcement, but if you're in that scenario, let's look at all the principles I've talked about earlier as far as due diligence, the people, the outliers, and perhaps go back and say, well, we probably were hacked, but maybe we need to do a little bit more in detecting it and so forth. Here's a few questions to ask law enforcement. For a matter of time, I won't go through all of this. I guess a few important things to pick out is, what type of data you're actually looking for, and will you do the data collection, or are you relying on us to do the data collection? Or, if they do, how will you do it? And it's important for the organization to understand, are you going to pull the plug on my machines? If that is important, if that's critical, that's something that needs to be discussed. Perhaps the agency doesn't know the alternatives. And it's important to understand that what the law enforcement objectives coming in. It's also really important to understand, to get an understanding of what information will that law enforcement agency share with you. Ask for the results of the analysis and other indicators that they may be able to share from other investigations, so that you as an organization can use that to help mitigate and protect your network from future attacks. In conclusion, and basically, response investigation should be seen as a critical component of the facets of the security matrix, not just the specific incident. It should take a holistic approach. So the focus shouldn't just be like, just on this one incident, but generally the whole security in general of that organization. It's important to bridge gaps. Security, my experience, exists in silos. Different security teams work on a very specific problem. As an incident responder or an investigative team, important to bridge those gaps. Go out to your team that manages the firewalls, or your team that does data leakage monitoring, or your pen testers. Bridge the gap between them so there's that platform or framework of communication across the organization. And ultimately, an incident responder investigator needs to be dynamic and have the ability to pivot quickly. Basically, the best laid plans of mice and men go awry. Relying on technology, chances are it may go awry, so you need to be able to pivot through that. So
let's get 2 rapid-fire questions to you, Christian. Right. I know people will really wrap it up. From Greg asking, is MCARTA a process or a software package? If it is a process, do investigators have a checklist associated with its use? Okay,
so MCARTA is a platform. So it's a platform consistent of processes of multiple tools. It's for law enforcement customers, and possibly for private sector customers. And don't quote me on this because I'm not. You need to speak to someone for that. It could be available. As far as who to contact, I don't know if that's something that maybe you could provide a contact for that.
We can do that.
Currently, it sits here locally at CERT, and we allow access to our law enforcement partners and some private sector partners.
Okay. You know what? We're gonna wrap up this session. We have to prepare for the next one is to start properly at 1:00. Christian, great presentation. Christian was a later addition to the program. Fantastic job.
Right,
appreciate the knowledge.